Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar today. Today we're going to talk about how to simplify the migration of roles and authorization to SAP S/4HANA. We've put in a couple of new slides and new content in case you have seen this presentation or a similar presentation from us in the past. Before we get started, actually let's wait maybe a minute or so longer. There are still people joining, so I don't want to have to repeat myself, so we'll give them a minute or so and then we will get started. All right, I would say we'll get started. So again, thank you for joining our webinar today. I'm going to talk about how to simplify the migration of roles and authorizations to S/4HANA. A couple of administrative things before I hand over to Alessandro, who will guide you through the presentation today. One is this webinar, as always, will be recorded and you will receive a link to the recording within 24 hours, and then you'll probably receive an email or two from me as well. With a copy of the slide deck and again a link to the recording on YouTube. And if you have any questions during the webinar, I'll be monitoring the questions box. So there is a little tab in your GoToWebinar control panel that's at least on my computer on the right-hand side, and you can expand that and type in your questions. So just feel free, as stuff pops into your head, ask us the questions. I'll monitor that box. I'll try to answer it if I can. If I can't, we're going to have a Q&A session at the end as well, and Alessandro has a chance to fill in whatever I couldn't answer, and anything we can't get to, we'll address them offline and then send out an email with the remaining questions. And with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Alessandro, and we can get going.
Perfect. Thank you, Michael. Hello, everyone. Alessandro Benzer. Today we'll be talking about simplifying or how we can simplify the migration of roles and authorizations to S/4HANA. We had that presentation earlier already, I think a year or so ago. We changed some of the content. Some will be similar because there wasn't a huge change. We just introduced new stuff that I think is worth to be addressed. From the agenda, we'll talk again, just for those of you that haven't heard the earlier presentation about what's new in S/4HANA. So we'll discuss that again. We'll briefly talk about SAP Fiori authorizations. We will not go into too much depth when it comes to Fiori. We have, or we had actually 4 specific webinars to SAP Fiori a few weeks ago, and I have the links to those recordings in the appendix of this presentation. So if you want to learn more about SAP Fiori, you want to have follow-up information, you can watch those webinars. So today we'll only talk about very briefly about Fiori, but why Fiori is so important with S4. We then talk about the simplifications that come with S4, because a lot of things are changing with S4. We'll give you a couple of examples, a couple of things that you have to consider when you move to S4 that have direct impact on the security. But then also we'll give you a couple of tools that you can check out for yourself, a couple of SAP standard tools that help you prepare for the S4. We'll also talk about different migration strategies. There's different ways how we can move roles to S4, and I have 2 or 3 slides as well how we can also using automation tools, how we can help you speed up the process or that migration effort that needs to be done. Just a few words about exciting who we are. For those of you who don't know us yet, we've been founded back in 2008 in Switzerland. We're still headquartered in Switzerland. We have 85 employees globally. We're all SAP security experts, so that's our specific focus is SAP security, mostly around roles and authorizations, but also GRC, single sign-on, solution manager, IDM, HANA as a database, everything around SAP Security, also cloud security. If you talk about IHE, IAS, IPS, we have a couple of webinars coming up in that regards as well. I'll have the schedule or the outline in the end as well, if you're interested in that. We're a global company now. We have still offices in Germany, Switzerland, where we're headquartered, but we also have offices in UK, Romania, and since 2016 in the United States. We have a very special relationship with SAP. We're an SAP Silver partner, but then we also have a very strong relationship with SAP Education. That means we're working as SAP trainers for training. So if you book a SAP training class through training.sap.com, it's very likely you're going to talk to one of our employees that delivers the trainings for SAP. So a very strong relationship together with SAP. And all in all, we're always trying to follow SAP's best practice, and all the tools we provide always following SAP's best practice and what SAP offers in general. For today, to get started with S/4HANA, because that's the topic. So we all know S/4HANA will come. Everyone's talking about S4. Some of you guys might already be in the process of moving to S4 or moved certain systems to S4 already, and others are planning it. Sooner or later we have to move because ECC will go out of maintenance, so we have to take the step and move to S4. So S4 will be the center of our future data world, so to say. With S/4HANA, what SAP did is SAP tried to do a lot of simplifications and consolidation of redundant applications that we very often see in ECC. And I have one example here, on the right-hand side. To, for example, register a vendor invoice in ECC, we can go through the module MM, or we can also go through the module FI. So there's different transactions in MM, different transactions in FI that allow us to enter or register a vendor invoice. In S/4HANA, there was a consolidation. There's only one module or one application available that's called invoice management. And what that basically means is, today, depending on what the user was doing, which transaction the user was using, there were different ways how we could enter a vendor invoice. Going forward, there will only be one central entry point to do that. That means we have to make those replacements from an authorization perspective, because the old transactions will be obsolete. You have to introduce the new ones. We also have to educate the users about those new ones. But then from a security perspective, we have to make sure those new transactions, they're properly authorized. We don't over-authorize someone, because a lot of transactions will become more a cockpit transaction. We'll be talking about that specifically about when we talk about a business partner. So a lot of, with that consolidation, a lot of transactions become more powerful, and so we have to deal with the authorizations more specifically and be more careful about. So at the end of the day, with all that consolidation, there will be a reduction of application and transactions. So a lot of transactions will go away. There's around 4,500 transactions that will be obsolete in S4. Those are very often transactions we use on a daily basis, or our end users use on a daily basis. And we have to reauthorize that according to the new data model and the new transactions and applications in S4. When moving to S/4HANA, S/4HANA is not a direct upgrade. It's not like when we implement an enhancement package. And S4 is a new installation or a reinstallation, and then we have to migrate. There's different ways how we can migrate. We can start from fresh. If you do a greenfield implementation, we can do a system conversion that's more a brownfield. There's in-between approaches. There's different approaches how it can be done from an entire system perspective, but then also from an authorization perspective. We have a lot of customers that say, with S4, this is we basically want to start on a fresh plate. We go the approach of a greenfield. So we set up an entire new system and we go through the entire configuration again, and we just implement what we really need. We kind of want to get rid of all that history we had in ECC. If you guys go down that route, that doesn't have to 100% apply to the roles. Roles, very often we do more a brownfield, so we basically take the roles we had and we try to migrate them over, or at least we reuse them and then build, maybe based on the old ones, new roles in S4. We'll talk about that, different ways we can do that in just a little bit. But what's important is it's not a direct upgrade, so we have to go through a migration process from an entire system perspective, but also from an authorization perspective. There's a lot of different changes that are happening in S4. Here I just outlined a few. I don't want to go into too much detail, but what's very important is there's a lot of stuff that has been changed and has been simplified. It has a lot of impact, especially in the finance area. A lot of things change in that aspect. And one of the core approaches that now really focused in S4 is that business partner approach. Business partner is nothing new to the world of SAP, has been around for many years. I think it was introduced with CRM many years ago. But now in S4HANA, that business partner approach is enforced. That means we have to use it. That means whenever we do maintenance to customer data, vendor master data, that now has to go through BP. So all our transactions like FK01, FK02, all those transactions will be replaced with BP. So that means, again, the old ones will be obsolete. We have to take them out and we have to authorize BP. But now BP is more like a cockpit transaction. So we can do vendor master, we can do customer master. And it all comes down to the authorization. So authorizing BP is a little bit of a challenge. We have to be very careful. Otherwise, we're kind of opening up the doors and we might introduce, critical access that even could lead to SOD conflicts and so on. So we have to be very careful when we implement, especially that BP. Then there's also other changes from a GL accounting perspective, asset accounting, that's completely redesigned. There's a completely new structure, how SAP does the GL and the asset accounting. That has a big impact. We'll see it on the next slide as well. But then also from FICO integration, there's a new central journal. So there's a new common table that is now enforced, which is great for your CFO. So your CFO would really like that and love to see that. But it also means we have to, change all those, all the elements that come with that. You can see it on the on the next slide. So again, a lot of new things, a lot of stuff that changed, a lot of consolidations that happened, a lot of transactions that will be replaced with new transactions, or that are even completely obsolete because they're not there anymore. There's no direct replacement. Some transactions will be replaced with Fiori applications. Other transactions will be replaced with WebDimpro applications. So there's a lot of things changing. Consolidation of modules, consolidation of transactions, and so on. So a lot of changes that we have to be aware of. We can also see it here. This is just a screenshot from an SAP slide, a little bit older, but it's still up to date. So SAP did a lot of simplifications in the aspect of sales and distribution, inventory management, the material ledger, accounting, and so on. A lot of things have been consolidated. When we just think about in the business suite on ECC, a lot of tables that were, there were a lot of tables that store different type of information. That's now consolidated. When we look at just the accounting here, there's a lot of tables in ECC that hold different type of data that all come back together to the general ledger. In S4, it's just a one main core table that stores that information. So that has an impact on the transactions, on SAP standard transactions that we have to make the replacement. That's one. But then also for customizations, if you have custom transaction, custom code, that's all impacted by that. If we read data from a table, that table might not be there in S4. And that's another aspect that we have to be aware of. So a lot of things are changing. From an S4HANA perspective, that was a question in the past webinars, and it came up quite a bit, and sometimes it's a little bit confusing what kind of deployment options that are available. So I just summarize it up here. I think there's 4 core deployments that are possible. We can go on a public cloud, we can go a private cloud, we can go into a managed cloud, or we can still have S4 on premise. What does that basically mean? The public cloud is basically software as a service, so hosted by SAP, maintained by SAP. We have very limited configuration and customization capabilities, so everything is kind of locked down because it's a multi-tenant system, which means there's other customers that use the same system, so to say. We're only basically working one tenant, and if we do, let's say we do a workbench change that we're doing in our on-premise, it would impact the entire system, which means it will also impact other customers of SAP. So the public cloud is really locked down. We cannot do much there. Most customers, if you have an ECC today and you have it customized, you will not go into the public cloud. So you will probably go into either a private cloud or you have it as an on-premise, either you have it hosted yourself or managed by, for example, by SAP, if you use the HEC cloud. Different ways how it can be done. What's important is the public cloud, there's the lock, so there's not much we can do. Also from an authorizations and security perspective, there's very limited we can do. We can build business roles, but the roles itself, the roles that we build in PFCG, they're given. It's not something we can, we can go in and we don't have any access to PFCG at all. We don't have access to SU01 at all. So it's all locked down. We have very limited capabilities to build some of the business roles, but we cannot go into PFCG and play around with the roles. Versus in the private cloud or in managed cloud or on-premise, SU01 and PFCG is open. We can build our own roles and assign them the way we want them. We can also use add-ons, like I put here, our tool, the XCMS, as an add-on. So on those three types, you can always also add add-ons like our tool or any other tool that's out there that's built for ABAP. S4 is still an ABAP system. So again, on the private managed and on-premise version, it's fully open. We have full access to the application server where we can basically do whatever we want to do. That's important. So different ways also how S4 can be deployed. If you have a lot of customizations, I think you will go to one of the right ones here, but not to the public cloud. I hope that makes sense. With S4HANA, what's important from an authorizations perspective, if you're authorization people think that's why we are all here, the good thing is the way we do authorizations will not change. So we can still use SU01, we can still use PFCG, we can still use ST Austrace and ST01. It's still the same tables. We still have the HER tables and the USOB tables and so on. So that's from that perspective, we can still use the tools we know from the past. Certainly with Fiori as a UI, there's a new things that come into play with how we build catalogs and groups and the spaces and pages. On the front end side, there's certainly some changes that we have to be aware of. But then from an authorization perspective, even with Fiori on the backend authorizations, which are most important thing, it's still ABAP. So it's still PFCG, ST Austrace, and so on. So that's important. With S4, what's important again, what I said earlier, the change in data model basically means we have to touch our roles. So we cannot move to S4 without making adjustments to our roles. It is 100% necessary because of all those changes that are happening. That's really the most important aspect of moving to S4 from an authorization perspective. There's also a few other things that we have to understand. That's our authorizations on the HANA database. So S4 runs on HANA. That's the only database that it will run on. There's certain authorizations or users that need to be created in HANA as database. That we have to deal with that as well. That's not that important. That's only for a few apps. If we use Fiori, for example, where we have to have a direct access to the database, but that's very limited. So most of the authorizations will still happen on the application server, which is an ABAP stack. That's important. Like I said, SAP Fiori becomes more important with S4. Why is that? SAP Fiori is not something that just came with S4. Fiori has been around long before S4, and Fiori is not just for S4. So we can install or use Fiori on ECC. Still possible. We can have Fiori apps for GRC. We can have Fiori apps for IDM. We can have Fiori apps for BW and CRM for different systems. With S4, Fiori becomes a central user interface. That means that a lot of applications, they move away from the SAP GUI, they move into Fiori. So with S4, Fiori kind of becomes mandatory because some applications and some functionality will only be available in Fiori. So for certain users, we need to implement Fiori. For example, to create and maintain banking information. That's transaction FI01 will not exist anymore in S4. It will be in Fiori, and therefore the users have to have that Fiori application and have to have access to that and has to be implemented and properly authorized. The problem when we move to S4 and we have those requirements with Fiori is that very often we want to go through what we call them Fiorization. That means that we want to make sure that our end users don't have to switch between the SAP GUI and the Fiori Launchpad, because that would be a pain in the butt. Let's call it out the way it is. If as an end user, I want to have it as simple as possible, fail safe. That's basically what I want, and I want to have only one entry point, and that's mostly Fiori when we go down the route with using Fiori. That means that every single transaction or application has to be in Fiori, and that means with that there will be some sort of complexity, because we have to implement and enable, and at the end of the day authorize all the Fiori applications. So with S4, very often customers implement Fiori on a larger scale, so really full-fledged basically. That adds some complexity, but then again the backend authorizations that are still required for Fiori, because Fiori is just a front end. It's not it's new applications, but the authorizations and the data still comes from the backend, and that's where we have to deal with the authorizations. So the authorizations will still be in ABAP on, for example, S4, and we just have to deal with the complexity of the front end, so to say, to build up Fiori, build up the launchpads, build up the structure, how we build that similar to our authorization concept that we have on the backend. That's another big aspect when we implement Fiori. How do we do that? The best approach is always to follow my authorization concept that I have in ABAP, and have it kind of like hand in hand, line in line, so that there's a similarity and we can maintain it throughout the entire landscape, from Fiori down to the application server, following the same principle and the same approaches. Again, if you want to learn more about Fiori, we had 4 specific webinars, overview webinars. We did deep dives, we did debugging, we looked into automation tools. I have the links posted at the end of this presentation. Here in this round for today, so it's important to understand that with S4, Fiori will become mandatory, because a lot of functionality will move into Fiori. From a Fiori security perspective, like I said, mostly we will deal with the backend authorizations. That's where we have to authorize the business data, so to say. But certainly with Fiori, we also have a different architecture. Maybe let's just spend a few minutes on that. With Fiori, we have a front-end server and we have a backend server. Depending on how we deploy it, it can be in an embedded approach, which means that the front end and the backend runs on the same system. So our S4 system, for example, can serve as a backend and as a front end at the same time. Or we can go down the route and do a central hub deployment, where we say it's called central hub deployment. What that basically means is the front end and the backend are 2 separate systems. There's different, as always, as advantages and disadvantages to either scenario. SAP recommends to use the embedded approach, where front end and backend is on the same system, so to say. That's just because of dependencies, because if we upgrade one, when we have a central hub deployment where we have one Fiori and, for example, multiple backends, if we update one, we have to update the other, which means if I update or upgrade one backend system, I have to upgrade Fiori, and if I upgrade Fiori, I have to also upgrade all the other backend systems. So I have a lot of dependencies, which can be very complex. So that's why SAP usually recommends the embedded approach, because if I upgrade my S4 system to the next support package, Fiori will go with it automatically, and I don't have any impacts on other systems. What's important with Fiori is we have front end and we have backend. And in either scenario, whether we go embedded or central hub, we have to have front-end authorizations and we have to have back-end authorizations. In an embedded scenario, that can be authorized through one role, basically. There's still different type of authorizations, but it can be done in one role. If we have 2 systems, one front-end, one back-end, split different systems, then we have to build a front-end role on the front-end server, one role that contains front-end authorizations, and we need a second role on the backend that comes with the backend authorizations. So that's important. But even if it's embedded, we still need both. And what we basically need on the front end, I don't want to go into too much details here, but on the front end, we need the front end authorizations. That means the OData services that basically give us access to the application, to the Fiori application, to the tile itself. That comes through OData services. And For the OData services or OData authorizations, there's two types of OData authorizations. It's basically the IWSG for frontend and the IWSV for backend. And that's very technical, but that's basically what we have to do. So on the front end, we have to authorize the front end authorizations, on the back end, the back end. And on the front end, all it really is either I can see the tile or I cannot. So the front end authorizations are pretty straightforward. Certainly I have to authorize that through a role. So I have to basically tell the front end role, which catalog and which group I want to authorize, and then also which application through the OData service. That's the one thing, but we don't have to deal with anything else than that. So I just say, okay, catalog A, group A, and then in that catalog, there's 4 apps, and I have to authorize those 4 apps. And all I need is the front-end OData authorizations for those apps, and then the user can see the apps on the Launchpad. What kind of data or what kind of authorizations the user has within that app, that's all down to the backend authorizations. So whether I can see one company code or the other, that's all handled in the backend. And that's where I have to deal with the authorizations in the backend. Also SAP24, when we have the authorization proposal database to deal with all the authorizations that are required, that's primarily maintained for the backend authorizations because that's where it is needed. And that's the kind of the complexity with Fiori, that the entry point is not a transaction anymore. It's an OData service. It's a start authorization as S service basically that needs to be authorized, but it kind of goes the same way as it goes with transactions. We can add the OData service to the role menu, and then the OData service will bring the authorization proposals from SAP24, and then we can deal with the authorizations in the authorization profile of the role. So it's the same way to authorize. It's just the start authorization is a little bit different because it's not a transaction anymore. As an example, it's now an OData service basically. That's the change with Fiori. I hope that makes sense. When we move to S4, what's important is to understand those changes. And so how do we understand those changes? I mentioned there's a lot of simplifications that happened, but how do we really know? As a customer, how do I know? SAP, with every S/4HANA release, SAP publishes a simplification list. If you want to find it, just go on Google and just search for SAP Simplification List or S/4HANA Simplification List. It will pop up right as the first result. What that basically is, it's a white paper from SAP that SAP publishes with every release and support package. And in that, it's a PDF document. And in that PDF document, SAP lists all the simplifications. The latest version is for S/4HANA 2020. It's 1,100 pages long, so it's quite a long document. I have the link here as well if you guys want to click through it. But that simplification list lists all the changes that come with that S4 release, and it will basically tell you what you have to do, to be able to migrate to S4. The problem with the simplification list, it looks like that example here. It's a PDF document that a lot of text, and then in the text it basically says here it's in regards of a customer data, I believe, where it says here in the middle, the user interface for SAP S/4HANA is transaction BP. There's no specific user interface for customer vendor, like known from Business Suite transactions like XD01, VD01, FD01, MK01, and so on. So what that basically means is here's a nice table. It says transactions not available in S4. All those transactions will not be available because they will be replaced with BP. That's good to know. Again, we have to go through the entire simplification list and process that document to see what is the replacement, what's obsolete, and then we have to go back to our rows and make those changes. So very time-consuming task, but that's the way we have to do it. SAP now in the latest releases offered us a couple of tools. I'll get to it in just a second, where we have kind of got some automation going, but not a lot, and we'll talk in just a second. But that's basically what the simplification list is. Everything that changes will be in the simplification list, and that's where we can, from there we can then basically make the changes. There are, like I just said, there's a couple of helpful tools. I have just a few listed here from a compatibility matrix or scope matrix tools that we can use to see, just from a roadmap perspective, what will not be developed any longer in S4. There's a subnote where you can get to more information posted here. There's also best practice explorers for S4, where you have like templates for processes. You have test scripts that allow you to to test and verify your S4 implementation if you have a sandbox, or just going the first trial basically with S4 if you want to see what can be done. That also the best practice explorer also has standard roles. So if you want to have better standard roles, you can use that here. I have the link. Then there's also a transformation navigator where you can basically get product recommendations for in regards of the target architecture, roadmaps, what transitions, tasks and steps you have to follow, and so on. And then last but not least, the tool we all know, Transaction SA25 for upgrades. Basically, there's now a new report in SA25 where we can see the obsolete transactions in the roles. So basically, the content from the simplification list now finally put into code, because that wasn't the case in the past years. Now it's finally there. And what the SA25 report basically tells us is all the T codes that are obsolete and to which role they belong, or which role those T codes are maintained. The problem is we cannot do any replacements. So that's still manual. At least now you see, okay, for my 10,000 roles, I have to touch 5,000 of them, and I kind of know what I have to replace. But that replacement still has to be done manually. So still a lot of work that you have to come up either way. In the past, that report was not available, so there was no help at all. So now at least we have that. When we go to S4, there's different ways we migrate, and we kind of try to simplify as much as possible here. But based on our experience, there's three main approaches that we very often see. I think we understand now that when we move to S4, we have to touch our roles. There's no way around that, because there's changes happening to the data model, new transactions, all those changes with Fiori. So we have to touch our existing roles. So now the question is, how do we do that? Depending on my situation, that can be entirely different for every single one of you. Depending on your current situation of ECC and the migration strategy you use, whether you go greenfield, brownfield, depending on how far off you from standard, or with that S4 transformation, you reintroduce a lot of things, or you do something completely different, then approaches vary quite a bit. Very commonly, what we see with customers that have a lot of problems today, let's say we have audit findings, SOD findings, a lot of different things, and we cannot wait to fix that. We kind of do a redesign in ECC, because there's a need. A lot of problems right now. The roles are in bad shape. They've been designed in 1998, and they haven't changed them ever since, and they're super bad. A lot of SD conflicts, bad design, never follow SP best practice. Everyone's over authorized. Let's prepare for S4, and let's do a redesign in ECC. So basically redesign your entire authorization concept in ECC, but always, excuse me, always in scope of S4. So I know an S4 migration is coming. So whatever I do now in ECC is always with that focus on an upcoming S4 migration. What does that mean? If I redesign ECC, I want to follow SAP's best practice. That means I will build the roles the way they are supposed to be built, and that's basically using SA24, the authorization proposal database. So we build all our roles in the context of SA24, which means every authorization object has to be proposed to SA24. Authorization should come from SA24 if possible, otherwise we deal with them in the role. But at the end of the day, all our roles are clean. They're all using SA24, always 100% true. And I do all the changes, if possible, through SA24. I clean up all my roles. I go live with my roles. I use them. Then, before we go to S4, there's still a little bit maintenance. Also, as part of the maintenance, I always follow that process. So 100% in SAP standard and following best practice. And when it comes time to move to S4, we just run them through a migration tool. and make the replacements that need to be done. Take care of the authorizations through SO24. Again, when we move to S4, we have to go through SO25 steps, bring in the new proposals, make updates to those proposals, do some SO24 optimization, so to say, and then use the roles we had, just make the replacements, deal with the authorizations, and have roles that work in S4. If we have solid roles in ECC, they can be very smoothly migrated to S4. We still have to do the replacements, take stuff out and add new stuff. But if you have proper proposals and we have built it through SAP standard, if I take a transaction out of the role, the authorization objects and values will also go out. When I go to S4 and I add the new T code, your new authorization proposals will come in. I have to fill in the blanks, but then the role should actually work. Still it needs to be tested, but it will work. If we don't follow that best practice, then what will happen is we have a very messy design in ECC, we migrate, and we have the bigger mess in S4. Especially when we take transactions out and the authorizations were added manually, or we have a lot of changed authorizations in our authorization profile, those will remain in the role. So that means I have a lot of orphaned authorizations that don't belong to any T code. There's no relationship, no very used list, so to say, back to the T code, and they just sit in there. And then I'm in S4. I have a whole bunch of authorizations that I have no idea why they're in there. I don't even know if they're still needed, and it's just a big mess. That's why when we want to migrate roles to S4 and want to do them properly, then we have to make sure that on ECC side, before we migrate, the roles are in proper shape. Some customers, they decide to do a redesign as part of an S4 migration. That's always questionable, but it can be done because the S4 is already a very big project, and then redesigning authorizations plus trying to keep up with the changes that S4 brings, especially if you do a lot of changes, might be tricky. But some customers go down the route. They say, you know what, we start completely fresh in S4 and we do that as part of the migration. Seeing that as well, what we most commonly see is the third one, and this is basically, we call it the quick and dirty approach. What that basically means is we keep our roles, our messy design. We know we have problems. We don't want to fix it in ECC because we have no time, we have no money, we have no resources available to do that. Let's just get those roles to S4, whatever it takes. I always say it's shit in, shit out. If a bad design today, we move to S4, it will not get better. It will be the same mess, but we will have roles that work in S4. So we just do whatever needs to be done. And then we know when we go live with S4, we know we are aware of that we have a bad design. We know it's not compliant to any rules that are out there. There's a lot of SODs, over authorizations, all the such. Let's do a proper redesign in S4. That's what, from our experience, what a lot of customers do. The migration to S4, there's different ways how we can do that with automation tools, especially that third one here. If you really just want to do quick and dirty, we have tools that really can do quick and dirty, but it will work on S4. Or always the preferred way is always to do a proper redesign either before or after. And for that, there's tools out there as well that can help you doing that. I'll show just 2 slides about that, how we can help you with that as well if you go through a redesign. But those are the 3 different approaches that we very often see. Again, if you have time to clean up your ECC, that's always preferred because there you have your usage, you know what users are doing, build them properly, and then have a nice design that works in ECC, and just do a conversion to S4 and it will work as well. Or if you don't have time, we had customers that called us up in November. They were going live in January and they didn't talk about authorizations all the way up till November. Michael's probably smiling, I cannot see him, but he remembers that conversation with that one customer. They totally forgot about security and they didn't deal with authorizations at all, but they were going to UAT, user acceptance testing in November, and then they realized the users cannot test because the roles will not work. That's because no one did the replacements, no one did anything, and then you just do a quick and dirty. So within 30 days, you migrate whatever you can migrate, and then January 1st, you try to go live, and then a few months later, you try to do a redesign. That's more common. Important is that we understand there is an impact on security. Either way, we have to touch the roles, whether we do it before as part of the migration or after. we have to touch the roles. That's the long story. So to be more specific, what needs to be done from an authorizations perspective when we move to S4? There's a couple of things, and this is more a manual approach. In the next slide, I will show you how we can automate a lot of those manual tasks if you use automation tools. But basically, what you have to do is you have to prepare the simplification list. Depending on your target release, if you're going on S/4HANA 2020 right now, or as an example, then you can use the SA25 report that will list the simplifications. You don't have to go through the PDF document yourself, but you prepare it one way or the other. And then usually what we do is we analyze our existing roles in the old system. So we look into the roles and we see, okay, there's 10,000 roles that is our scope, depending on your size, obviously. But let's say there's 10,000 roles that are in scope that we have to migrate over because they're currently assigned to our end users. And let's analyze those 10,000 roles and where do we have to make any changes. Because some of the roles will work. If you have, for example, basis roles for our security people, like yourself, SU01, PFCG, all that. Those roles will work one-to-one in S4. So we don't have to touch them. Also for business users, depending on what transactions they have, those roles might work one-on-one. But then there's probably a whole bunch of roles, and I'm pretty sure it's 60% or more that need to be touched one way or the other. So we always want to analyze the scope, what needs to be changed, and then also more details, what needs to be done as well. When we then go to S4 and we have S4 running, the first thing we always want to do is we want to optimize SA24. So we want to run through the SA25 steps, want to do SA24 optimizations if possible. I understand not everyone is a big fan of SA24 because it's time consuming to do, but that's SAP's best practice. Always recommended. You don't have to use it, that's important, but that's the best practice. We always recommend to do that, and optimizing it makes it just easier when we start building the roles in S4, whether we start from scratch or whether we migrate. If we have proper proposals, then the role building will become significantly easier because we have true proposals that actually work. On S4, certainly also will be Fiori. Like I said, a couple of T codes, they have Fiori as a replacement, so we have to implement Fiori. Depending on what way we go, we just say, okay, we have a more hybrid approach. We do certain things in GUI, and then just what is absolutely mandatory in Fiori. Then we might not have so many apps that we have to implement, might be 30, 50, but not more. Or a lot of customers say, no, we do a Fiorization. We want to move our end users, our business users to Fiori. Then certainly there's a lot more that needs to be done in Fiori. What we basically do there, and again, I always refer back to the webinars that we had. We can use usage information from the old system. So we can use ST03N, the statistical usage data, to find the used transaction codes. And then with the app recommendation library that we can access through the Fiori apps library, we can see what are replacement T codes, replacement Fiori applications for our legacy T codes that we can potentially use. And then, we certainly have to implement and do all the configuration, but that's what needs to be done. And then at the end of the day, Fiori is one thing, but then we also have to build and adjust the roles and authorizations in S4, meaning if you migrate over, we have to touch them. If you start from scratch, we have to build them. If we go with Fiori, we might have to build new roles for Fiori, or we might extend the current roles that we already have, especially if you do an embedded scenario. We might put the Fiori stuff into existing roles. There's different ways how that can be done, but it needs to be done. That's just what it is. And then a big topic as well is always testing. How do we validate the new roles? How can we test? Because when we, in a traditional S4 migration, how we have seen it is we have functional tests, then we have user acceptance tests, but at the end of the day, it's like 3 or 4 test cycles that we go through. So in the first functional test, we don't want to deal with authorization failures, because we want to functionally test S4. We want to see if the processes work and do functional testing. We don't want to deal with authorization. So when do we test authorizations in S4? Always a big challenge. In the last UAT, we want to be like, we want to sign off on stuff. So it's always a challenge. How do we validate that concept? But it needs to be done, because those new transactions will bring new authorizations, new authorization objects, new values. We don't know them from ECC. We only know them in S4. So we have to kind of go through testing. We cannot trace anyone because no one is currently productively using S4. So we have to kind of test through UATs and functional tests. That's important. And then one big topic is always go live as well. So we go live, we have new roles or adjusted roles. What's the fallback? So what in case, next Monday we go live with S4 and no one can work, or only half of them can work? Big problem. So fallback scenarios as well. Certainly when we move to S4, and we have seen it very often, we're very generous with authorizations, or our customers are very generous with authorizations. They say, you know what, I just want to make it work, especially when we do a quick and dirty approach and say, okay, we just want to go live, we just want to work, and once we have it working, then we will redesign later. That's one approach. The thing is with that, we have auditors, depending on your situation with your company. If you're a listed company, publicly listed company, you have to follow SOX compliance, and you have to have your SODs and critical access under control, and that's always a problem. And when I say that, what we should not forget as part of the S4 migration is our GRC tool, for example, SAP Access Control. If we keep on using the old rule set from ECC and we go to S4, then a lot of risks will disappear, and we will see a lot of false negatives because we took the old transactions out, but now we added the new ones. And if the rule set doesn't know the new transactions or the Fiori applications, we will not see any risks. So we have a lot of false negatives. So when we move to S4, don't forget about the GRC rule set. That needs to be considered as well. That's very important. So what can we do? What I just said, different steps need to be done. Very time consuming. I just want to spend 2 or 3 slides here. What XCMS, our automation solution, can do for you. Basically, for all those steps that I just mentioned, we have automations and simplifications. So we have, for example, that entire simplification list that I mentioned for every single release since 2008, 18, or I think even early 2017. For every S4 release that was out there, we have simplifications. So for every release and support package, we have simplifications. So if you go to 1909 or to S4HANA 2020, we have the simplifications. We can in 2 minutes analyze all your roles and tell you what's the impact to S4. So what are the obsolete transactions, what is the replacement, what needs to be done, what has to go to Fiori. All that we can tell you within 2 minutes, basically. So we can automatically analyze that. Then also in S4, we can help you automate a lot. We can automatically optimize S24 based on system rules. We can do code scanning. We have code scanners that can go through code, custom code, partner code, to find authorization checks, propose them into S24. So when you start building the roles or changing the roles, you have the proper proposals. Also, that entire redesigning or adjusting the roles to make them S4 compatible, that can be automated. We can import that into our tools, and as an output, we have roles that are compatible to S4. So we can also automate that. I put it here as a semi-automatically. That basically means there's a couple of steps, but it's a very smooth process, a very fast process to move the roles over to S4. Then also when it comes to Fiori, especially when we do a Fiorization, where we will implement hundreds and if not thousands of Fiori applications, but not just true Fiori applications, maybe also applications that are not true Fiori, like a transaction that doesn't exist as a Fiori UI5 application. We might enable for Fiori, like for example SU01 or PFCG. There's no Fiori application for it, but we can still enable that transaction to be used in the Fiori Launchpad. So if we go through that Fiorization, as we call it, we have to create a lot of catalogs and groups, or in S4HANA 2020, the pages and the spaces, how we display the Fiori Launchpad. All that in SAP Standard, you can only create them one by one. It's a manual approach. We have tools to mass create that based on Excel file. Put them in Excel, they want to build, load it into the tool creates it for us. It takes a few minutes and it's all created. But then also the role testing. Role testing is always a big topic, like I just mentioned. When do we test the new role or the new roles? Can we do that as part of the functional test? If you do it manually, it's very tricky because you don't want to impact your functional testers. With our tool, we can do that because we can shadow users based on what they're doing. So we can shadow our functional testers and then bring that information based on what they were doing, what transactions they ran, which authorization objects were required, values that were required, and see what is missing in our roles. So we can do that comparison and do the updates. But then also when we do the next test, we can even test that further. And then when we go into a UAT, user acceptance, we already have those roles pre-tested. So when we go and do a user acceptance testing, our testers will not run into stupid authorization failures. They will still have some, we cannot avoid that 100%, but it will be 95% less because we have already pre-tested those roles to functional testing and so on. So a very interesting, a very unique way of going through those test cycles in S4 to make it more friendly and easier for us, but also for the end users that are not impacted. That's also important. And then also, like I mentioned, go live, always a big problem. Your management will always ask you, what's the mitigation strategy when you go live? How can we have a fallback? Because just because we don't go to S4, we still have to produce next week. We still have to serve our customers. For that, we also have different fallback scenarios that we have available with different types of authorizations, and also can be able to monitor and have approval processes. All that automation tools can help you do. And then also from a rule set perspective, which I just mentioned, we can also help you analyze your rule set. So if you have customization and don't know where you are and what needs to be done, we have a report similar to the very first point here, where we can analyze all your existing roles. We can also automatically analyze your GRC rule set and press a button, and we know what needs to be changed in the rule set to make it S4 compatible, and so on. So a lot of things that tools can automate. The tool I mentioned, and really just 2 slides, the tool I mentioned is the Exciting Authorizations Management Suite. That's our tool, been around for 10 years, more than 10 years actually. And the XCMS is basically an ABAP add-on, so we would install it on S4, also on Fiori. That allows us to simplify the entire role design, role maintenance, a lot of automation possibilities. We can help you with role testing, not just in an S4 migration. If you do redesign on ECC or redesign on S4, all that stuff, we can do code scanning to find authorization checks and security aspects of custom code, partner code, or standard code, and then also validating your entire security landscape in S4 or on ECC. That's all possible through automations. So if you're interested, we have dedicated webinars to the XCMS as well. I have here 2 more screenshots just to show you a little bit how it looks like. What's important is the XCMS is endorsed by SAP, so there's an SAP note that recommends to use the XCMS for, in this example here, specifically for RFC users. If you do RFC user redesigns, which is also something when we go to S4, RFC users have to be authorized as well. It should not be sub all. So how we do that? Our tool has a lot of capabilities for RFC specifically, but then also for every other authorization out there for end users, for example. The XCMS is a suite of tools, different tools that do different things. Like I just mentioned, we have code scanners. We have, from a role design perspective, we have tools. We have validation tools to analyze your entire secure landscape, not just roles and authorizations. We can look into gateway security, different type of security. But then the core functionality is around roles and authorizations, and really making all that easier and automating, everything you kind of do manually today. And I have literally 2 more screenshots just to show you what I just mentioned for the role analysis on ECC, for example. So we have one report in one of our tools here that's called migration of roles to S4. It allows us to scan through all your roles. Here, I just scanned a couple of standard test roles that I have in my system. And what it basically tells us is how many T codes or other menu objects are obsolete in S4. So for example, we can see here in one role, there's 848 that are obsolete. That's a big role, totally understand. But for those 848, we have to take them out and we have to add 80 new ones. There's a lot of replacements. But then also in other roles where we have less, there's always replacements. And what that report does, we can go through all the roles, we see what's obsolete, what can be reintroduced. We can make adjustments directly here if we want to, or we can use another tool that's called the role designer that makes all those replacements for us, and we can also validate that new role design. And what that basically means is we can see it here. We have obsolete transactions like FD03, FI03, and so on. And we can then see what's the replacement. So some replacements are in as a transaction, like for example, for FD03, like customer master, will be in BP. I mentioned that earlier, the business partner concept that's enforced. But then other transactions, like for example, the display banks, that's not available as a transaction code. It will be available as a Fiori app. So we have to deal with the Fiori backend authorizations, and that's the replacement we would do on your backend role, and so on. So all those replacements, our tool knows that comes from the simplification list and our knowledge from doing many projects, and that can be automatically adjusted. And how does that work? We basically import your old roles, we import user information, usage information, and we apply the new data model. Role designer is, that magic tool. We press a button, and at the end of the day, we have a design that is compatible for S4. So we can do all those replacements. With that role designer, we can do many, many more things as part of the migration. We can also optimize roles. We can take stuff out that was never used in the past. If you have, roles with 200 T codes and 50 of them have never been used, we can, for example, take them out. So all that type of analysis can be done as well as part of that migration. So automation tool, a great thing. When you move to S4, if you implement Fiori, it really speeds up projects and reduces efforts by at least 75%. That's what we commonly hear from our customers. A couple of things, lessons learned from going through S4 migration projects. What's important, simplification list is not 100% complete. So there's always stuff that's missing. That's okay. I mean, I also understand and feel for SAP because a lot of change is happening. Thousands of people are working on S4, and everything has to go back to simplification list. So some stuff just gets forgotten. With business partner that enforced concept as well, there's a couple of very odd things. For example, if you want to have display roles, it does a hard-coded check on ST code for XK03 and XD03. So even though those transactions are obsolete, we cannot use them anymore, but for whatever reason, there's a hard-coded ST code check that we have to be aware of. So we have to, make those, or have to be aware of stuff like that. Also, old authorization objects that should be replaced, they're not, they're still being checked. SC24 is not perfect, needs to be updated. And like I said, using automation tools can really, speed up the migration. To wrap it up, S4HANA, like I said, very exciting new platform, comes with a lot of changes and challenges, nothing to be afraid of, can all be handled. The new data model brings complexity to the roles that we have to deal with, so we have to touch the roles and make changes. And at the end of the day, because of that, whenever we migrate to S4, we have to touch the roles. So it's kind of a redesign, whether it's a large redesign or it's a more quick and dirty approach, we have to touch the roles. If you move to S4, don't forget security, and also don't forget GRC, because the rule set, like I said, if you don't update the GRC rule set, then in S4 we run a risk analysis. We'll have a lot of false negatives, which our auditors will not be very happy about. So just don't forget the rule set. If you are on GRC 12.0, then you can implement or activate the content for S4 and Fiori. If you're still on 10.1, which you shouldn't be because it's out of maintenance, you should actually move to 12.0. If you're still on 10.1, as of support package 19, there's those rules as well. So either or 10.1 support package 19 or then 12.0, you will have the rules. Just what I mentioned before, if you want to learn more about Fiori, we had 4 specific webinars about Fiori. Here are the links. We'll send out all the information so you will have it. Don't have to type it up now. That's available if you want to learn more about Fiori. If there's something missing that you want to see, let us know. We provide workshops and even just jump on a call free of charge if you want to learn or talk more specifically, just let us know. And then also just looking forward, what's coming up next. If you have IDM, SAP IDM, if you want to see how you can implement Fiori UIs in kind of like a rapid deployment scenario in 2-3 days, so super quick. There's a webinar coming up, I think in 2 weeks time. Here's the registration. And then also we're very proud, I'm looking forward to March. We called it Cloud March Madness. So in March, we will have a lot of webinars around cloud security. We talk about cloud security in general, what products are available with the IHE, IPS, the IAS, the SAP Identity, Cloud Identity now. So we have overview webinars here specifically about just cloud security in general, for IPS, for IHE, but then also in the next slide, we have also specific webinars then for single sign-on in the cloud, how we can connect IHE with SAP Access Control GRC, that bridging scenario, different types of life cycles. So for example, how can we do HR-driven identity life cycles in IHE if you have a success factors, for example, how does that work? And also, last but not least, the hybrid identity management with SAP IDM. How does it work, SAP IDM, in relation with the IPS, IAS in the cloud to deal with hybrid landscapes if you have on-premise and cloud systems, for example. So very interesting webinars coming up in March. Don't forget to sign up. If you cannot make one of the dates, just sign up. We send out the recording. You don't have to attend live. You can just watch it at your own time, but don't forget to register. With that being said, Michael, I think I'm a little bit over the time, 1 minute.
Yes, you are. But hopefully some people have still time to hang around a little bit, and so we can get through at least some of the questions. We got a ton of them, so let me start picking out some here. There was an interesting one that says, we have a lot of enabler roles, not for org values, but for other purposes. And will the XCMS validate these while migrating to S4?
Yes, so it depends how you have your enablers built. But if you have them built through the menu, then yes, 100%. The enabler is always the problem because you basically break SAP standards. We're not using the proposals. When you say you're not using it for the org values, I might be interested to understand how that really works. But I would say probably yes, because we can even work with enablers to some extent. Yeah, I would say best just to reach out, but I would say in general, yes, we can help you as well with those.
Okay, cool. Next question, is there an impact with BP, HR, the user master record, and central user administration?
Not sure if I understand the question correctly. I mean, the central user administration, if you use like a CUA, that will still be the same in S4, because it's S4 is nothing else than your ECC. Basically, you can provision it from a central user administration as well. That's possible. Also from role assignments, that's all the same. HR specifically, Michael, do you know more from the question? Not sure.
No, I'm not sure how those 1, 2, 3, 4 components really link together, and what the context is. But so maybe we'd have to have a follow-up discussion to figure out what exactly is meant here. Next question is how to restrict the BP access with granular level. So I guess the question really goes back to, since BP can do now so much.
Yeah.
How can you authorize that and restrict it properly?
So the good news is you can authorize and restrict, but it really comes down to the authorization objects and fields, and then basically what values you put into the field. So we have to be more careful, especially because when we had separate vendor master and separate customer master transactions, we had the proposals that limited us, for example, to customer and vendor. With BP, those proposals will be open. So when we go into the role and we go into the authorization profile with BP, we have to be very specific what values we put into the authorization profile. The good news there is SAP will pretty soon release a new version of SE24 that's called SE24N for new, and with that we can build different variants, and then we can also deal with that, especially with difficulties like BP, for example, already in SE24N, in the new SE24. Then it will make it a little bit simpler, but other than that, it comes down to the authorizations.
Okay, and that really leads into the next question. Does SAP have specific or new proposals for BP? So or do they just leave it open and up to you or to the customer?
It's very limited with the proposal. It's very limited. So it's basically up to the customer, because it also depends a little bit on the use case and the situation, but it's basically open. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Let's see what else we got there. Does the XCMS track Fiori app usage and analyze the migration impact?
Fiori apps usage is a problem in general because there's nothing that really, as far as I'm concerned, as I know, there's nothing that locks like transaction usage. I don't think we have that in Fiori. I don't think there's any SAP Center tool that locks Fiori usage. But from an impact or from a merging or migration perspective, or even just implementing, we can look into transaction usage and automatically tell you what app would be there for Fiori. So that can be, but that's based on usage from, for example, from your old system, from transaction usage. There's no tracking or statistical use data for Fiori application execution.
Okay. Next one is, what is the best approach according to you to build Fiori catalogs and groups? Is it like a one-to-one relationship, or what's the recommendation?
So the recommendation is basically when we build groups, that we kind of build them catalog clean. So that means when we build groups, we use apps from one catalog only. I know it's possible to combine multiple applications from multiple catalogs into one group. That's possible. The functionality is there. But from a best practice perspective, SAP even says try to build them catalog clean, which means you only use applications from one catalog in one group. That makes it also easier from an authorization perspective, because you have to, at the end of the day, you have to authorize the end user, so you have to build the PFCG role where you add the catalog and the group. And it's easier if you have a one-to-one relationship rather than you have a catalog and then you have to add, I don't know, we have one group and you have to add 5 catalogs. That's a little more complex. Also when it comes to ongoing changes and ongoing maintenance, to say. So
okay.
Always look clean.
Let's do one more to be conscious of time, because it's already 7 minutes past the hour. The last question is it recommended in the embedded setup to have a composite role with individual roles? So one for Fiori catalogs and groups, and a second one with service authorizations and any other required authorizations from SU24.
So with those front and back end is always the question, in a few years, like 2-3 years ago, the recommendation was to have a central hub deployment. SAP revised that statement. Now it's the recommendation is the embedded scenario. Like I said, we have to authorize front end and back end. Whether we do it in one role or 2 roles doesn't matter. I personally, right now, we're more going down the route where we use one role rather than having 2 roles. It used to be that we more recommended to go, build one role or build one front-end role and one back-end role, even if it's the same system. And then, we did or some customers did like that, went through the route with a composite, put them both in there and only assigned a composite. I think right now the recommendation is always just build one role and put everything in there, the front-end and the back-end. Because the front-end is only the one S service or S service authorization alone. There's nothing else other than that, the catalog and the group. But that's something you add to the backend authorization as well. So all that the front end really is just the S service with the start authorizations for the IWSG object. And from that perspective, our recommendation is always to use one role.
Okay.
In the past, sorry if I'm more longer going that one. In the past, we kind of said split it because we were never sure whether we would go away from the embedded scenario. So if we start with an embedded, then we want to split it into central hub, because that was the recommendation for SAP for many years. Then it was easier because you had separate front end and separate backend roles. So if you change the deployment, you could just move the roles and basically it would still work. If you would do that with a role that has both in one, then you would have to basically go in and split all the roles. That's why it was earlier, but right now the recommendation is always to go with the embedded. That's 100% I'm supporting that, just because of dependencies. And from that perspective, I think one role is perfectly fine.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you very much again to you, Alessandro, and to everyone who attended and stuck with us here a little bit longer than usual. Again, we'll send out a link to the recording. We'll answer the questions, Alessandro, right? And send them out as well. And see you in the next webinar. We'll also send out an announcement for the upcoming webinar, so stay tuned for those, and we'll see you soon again. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.